me. You may notice that things look a little bit different this month. We're really excited to try a new configuration that allows us all to see each other, and for the speakers to see you and be able to receive some nonverbal feedback from attendees. We just have been feeling like the webinar format can be a little dry, so we're excited to test this out. First, I do want to kick us off by just saying thank you so much to this month's program sponsor, Fire Ant Communications. Fire Ant's founder and president, Paula Machado, is a member of our chapter's board of directors, and she kindly offered to sponsor this month's program. So I'll kick it over to her to say a few words.
Thank you, Casey, so much. It's really an honor to be able to sponsor such an amazing event. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had, you know, right now with how everything's going on. When we talk about just diversity, inclusion, equality is very important. This month, we're actually celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, and as a proud Puerto Rican Cuban, you know, woman, it's very important to talk about how important this is. And this is a shameless plug. I am part of the board. I'm the Assistant VP of Membership. So you guys have been receiving all the emails that it is time to renew your membership. So please, please, please do that. We have a very exciting campaign that's about to launch where you'll have many details soon, but you will be getting emails. If you're part of FPRA Orlando and you're a member and you have not joined our Facebook group, you can feel free to message myself or Elia Santiago, who is the VP of Membership, and we're here to help. You can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, wherever you want. But thank you so much. And Dr. Earl, we're very, very, very excited to have you here and have this conversation with us. So thank you so much, guys.
Thanks so much, Paula. So just a couple housekeeping notes. Obviously, like I said, for those of you who may have missed it in the beginning, we're looking a little bit different this month. We wanted to make it a meeting so that we could all see each other. Please keep yourselves on mute throughout the conversation. And then at the end for Q&A, feel free to unmute yourself and just jump right in and ask questions of our speakers. I know they're really excited to hear from you. Of course, the chat function is also a great way to ask questions or interact with each other. But thanks to everyone who's here today and testing out this new configuration with us. So in June, our chapter's board of directors committed to provide space for members to discuss the important issues of equity, justice, and inclusion, especially as they relate to our ethical duties to serve the public interest and to maintain our strong community connection. Today's program provides that space, and it will help us all face the challenges that come with serving as agents for effective and actionable change in our personal and professional communities. So now it's my pleasure to invite former FPRA Orlando chapter president and external communications manager for Advent Health, Jeff Granger, APR, who's going to take the mic and introduce our speaker for today. Take it away, Jeff.
All right, thanks, Casey. Thanks very much. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I think this is going to be a great conversation and I'm super excited. And as Casey mentioned, you know, we're going to start the conversation, but as things come up, if you want to put questions in the chat, that's great. We'll try to leave some time for Q&A at the end for conversational Q&A, but again, as stuff comes up, please put it in the chat and I'll try to get to your questions. So it's not just the two of us speaking. And speaking of the two of us, the other person I'm talking about is Dr. Earl Mowatt, and he is the Vice President of Education at the onePULSE Foundation. He's a sociologist by trade and training. And his role with the foundation is to steer the vision of acceptance and inclusion into onePULSE Foundation's educational programs. He's got a bunch of other cool stuff on his resume, but we won't spend a lot of time reading all that and just say thank you, Dr. Earl, for joining us. It's great to have you here, and I'm super excited.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here today because, you know, we really have to have this national conversation. So we're going to kickstart that out. So I'll pivot back to you, Jeff. Just really excited about it.
Yeah, and you know, I think, you know, Dr. Earl and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I sort of explained to him kind of what the role of what we do kind of collectively, this group who's on this call today, is it's our job to message for our organizations. And now always that message is super important, but I think how we respond to the, the climate of diversity and inclusion at this time in history is super important. So that's why I think this conversation is so important. So we'll get right started. And, this is kind of a broad question, but just to lay the groundwork, what does diversity and inclusion even mean to you, both personally and as a professional? And how do we get there? Like, what's step one, right? What does it mean, and how do we get there? No, easy question, right?
Easy, but not so easy, right? Because there's a fundamental thing here that's missing in diversity and inclusion. First of all, it's the diametric opposites of the two words, diversity and inclusion. They almost mean sort of like they're opposites, right? But then we want to package it so it nicely, so that it has some kind of meaning to it. So here's a crucial thing that I think, right, works. And this is based on a science, social psychology science. We have to come to terms that we are actually more alike than we are different, right? So the beauty with diversity, when we talk about it, is that we can get to, appreciate our unique individual characteristics that makes us whole, right? Because everybody needs that. But we also have to understand how that plays a part in the collective, that we're not so much different, but we are actually more similar in things that we value. And if we can hold on to that meaning or make it, I want to say salient to us throughout, the course of our activities, then we could actually have, really harmonious, cohesive work processes where people don't have to relinquish their individuating characteristics that make them whole, such as being female, being, part of LGBTQ, being male, whatever. We can still maintain that, but understand how that works together. So I know in developing the programs at onePULSE Foundation, we hold on to that and we look at it, we pose it from three areas of human behavior: how we think about each other, how we relate with each other, and then how we influence each other. We can, get that nexus of all those three things, and we can have these really great work processes. It's a matter of thinking about people differently, that we're actually more alike than different. And that's one of the things that I think is missing. You asked me what's important about diversity, why it's so important, is that the key thing is that to understand that we are actually more alike. And now that relies on the science that says that it's not opposites attract, it's birds of a feather. So we come to that understanding. We're embedding that into our programs so that we can have highly effective work processes.
And one of the things I think that when we talked before that struck me that you said was that is the whole, I think there's this tendency when companies think about diversity and inclusion to say, look, we have a group for this group and we have a group for that group, and here are all these separate groups that we recognize, when in fact it's all of us bringing all those differences together is what's the important part.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because look, we have to look at diversity as more than checking off boxes, because I'll tell you why. There are two reasons, really bad reasons with that. One is diversity works when you can bring people and bring their ideas, their unique ideas into the table, right? Into the functioning of the organization. Because when you do that, then the ideas and whatever the organization is working on, it really gets a fuel injected. So it can do some wonderful things. Here's a problem though. A lot of times when we check the box, all we do is bring the different groups in, right? We bring them in, but they don't have development or opportunity to grow. So they stay in that particular spot. Well, while they see the peers actually, their peers actually moving up, but the peers might not be part of that diverse group because it's likely not, right? And people from, whether you're, female or Latino, African-American, or even LGBTQ, we see that momentum where we stagnate and don't advance. So here's the thing though, right? So part of the growth and development department is to get everybody's ideas together onto the table, and that's how you experience growth. So going back to what you're saying though, is that, well, if you can say diversity and inclusion, you bring people in, and then, but if they stagnate and don't contribute, then all you have are checkboxes and numbers, and that's it. But you're not really operating on a robust engine at that point.
And so, since we're all in charge, since we're communicators and messengers, it's super important, obviously, to have those cultures within these companies. But and this again, one of those simple questions, what's a good way to tell the world about that work that you're doing without having it seem self-serving and not having it be, just, hey, look at us, we're doing these cool diversity and inclusion things.
Okay, so did I understand the question? You mean as from public relations, how you can communicate that message?
Yeah, right. And how do you communicate not only to the outside world, but to your own employees that the culture of diversity and inclusion in our group, in our agency is important,
Okay.
How do you get that message across? And again, it's one of those simple questions in quotes.
Okay, it really is a simple question, but it's a little complex, right? Because to get that message into the company that diversity and inclusion is important, here's the I don't know what to say problem, but the concern is that it has to start from the top, right? So because the top creates the culture of the organization. All right, so if it doesn't start from the top, then it becomes a serious barrier, right? Because we know that everybody wants to have a diversity and inclusion program, and so we start again checking off the box. Let's bring it in, right? But unless the leadership really believes it, right? Really believes it, then that can't. And I shouldn't say can't, but it becomes a barrier for that culture. To permeate throughout the culture. So the trick is to get the leadership to understand the value of diversity and inclusion, where it's not just a matter of checking off boxes. But there's a problem with that. We operate on implicit biases. So it's not a matter of just saying to the leader, okay, well, you got to embrace this, because they'll probably just bring the programs in, but not really have the heart and feeling for it, and whether they realize that or not, right? So then the programs themselves don't gain traction because it's not coming from the top. Now, I've had the pleasure of working and partnering with organizations, and you can really see it where the leadership really believes in this and how diversity and inclusion manifests into the work operations. And then I've also had the pleasure also of working in organizations where it's not the culture, but they feel that they need to have it, and completely, there's a dichotomy in the differences here. So how do you challenge that or how do you address that when it's not the leadership, right? Well, then it might have to be a grassroots from the bottom up, instead of top down to bottom up. So, diversity groups can form and coalesce and then try to bring that culture up. So you have the different, areas, whether, again, gender, sexuality, whatever groups, and then have that kind of move upwards to the organization.
So I think that's a great point that you just made there is an absence of, a strong leader who this is important to, who this issue is important to. What are some of your tips if I'm a low-level employee within an organization and want to start that grassroots?
Yeah.
What are some of good tips to try to bring that to fruition?
Okay, so it's not for everybody, right? It
That's
takes
right.
a lot of courage, because sometimes you just want to belong, right? You don't want to be that one, that person that the disruptor, so to speak. And then when we have these conversations, they become a little precarious. People don't want to really have those conversations. So it will take encouragement. Really, when we talk about a grassroots effort, it will take not just one person, but one person to bring the idea to others. So I would start with, if the individual is so inclined, bring it up to HR, and then be a part of that, diversity movement, right? Because it's not going to happen on its own. And if you are in that situation where, the leadership kind of prevents it, even though the leadership kind of wants it, but, it's just a checkbox, then the only suggestion really is to, develop that courage that's needed. But the unfortunate thing is that's a hard process, because people are, impression management comes to play. I don't want to be perceived as that person. But I think that in my experience in the past, people do not really object to it, and there are a lot of times people actually want it. But it's that pluralistic ignorance thing where you think that everybody thinks the way that everybody thinks, but they don't really think that way. You know what I mean? Like, they really want it, but you're looking at them like, yeah, they don't really want it, but they really do want it. So it's about a matter of breaking down that shield and just jumping into it.
I think that's another good. I think that's another good point you bring up. Is people are so quick to make assumptions that I think this way, and therefore maybe the rest of my organization thinks this way. And sometimes it just takes that first person with that first courage to be that leader, whether it's a leader or not, or someone not in a leadership position.
You're absolutely right. And that's key to addressing this, right? You know, we always think that people think a certain way, and we think that our thoughts might not be aligned, but you know what? We're pretty average, and what we think a lot of times other people think the same thing, but because nobody's raising it, they think that raising a point, and then they think that everybody thinks the same way. And that we see that in leadership a lot, right? Nobody wants to question leadership, so then everybody thinks that everybody's aligned with leadership. But hey, wait a minute, you know, we need more diversity here. You know, raise that flag and then see what happens. But usually that comes with really good outcomes.
I'm shocked to find out that I'm average. I'm just saying. No,
we really are. We really are.
I'll put in a plug here. You know, please ask your questions in the chat section as we go along here. Again, we'll open it up for verbal questions a little bit later. But Dr. Earl and I could chat all day, but I think we want this to be a conversation with everybody. So feel free to throw stuff in the chat if you like as we go along. I want to talk. So, you know, obviously part of the reason why we're having this conversation to begin with is there's so much going on in the culture with the Black Lives Matter movement. Obviously we're coming into an election season. Tensions are super high with COVID. How does that change all those attitudes, those tensions, all those different things going on? How does that impact, you know, obviously diversity and inclusion programs leading up to this helps this, but how does that impact what you see organizations doing now, and how do you think all the cultural things happening should impact an organization?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that question. First of all, we have to make a distinction that racism or anti-racism is not diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion, or the lack thereof, actually is a symptom of, you know, racism, whether it's against any kind of ism, really. You know, it's not just race, it's gender, it's, you know, LGBTQ, all these isms, right? But the thing is that we have to be conscious of is the interplay of the two, right? When we talk about what's going on in society right now, anti-racism, right, is a big thing. I don't usually politicize things, and I'm not going to, but I kind of get where people come from when they make decisions, because a nation's not willing to, in general, have a conversation on white privilege. Oh my gosh, did I just say that? that bomb of a word, boom, explosion. Yeah, well, let's not talk about that because it doesn't exist. But you know, though, we have to really have a conversation on that. White privilege, it kind of triggers a defensiveness because of the nature of the word. You know, the word, it kind of presumes that people are privileged, but it's not. And if it triggers defensiveness, then people don't want to have an open conversation. They just shut the conversation down. But for us to really ameliorate some of these things going on, we have to have that conversation. And to put it in context to what's going on in society right now, it's like, you know, well, it must be great to be able to navigate through life without being, you know, having stereotypes being imposed onto you, harmful stereotypes or profiling. I can't imagine what that's like, but I imagine it'd be a wonderful world, right? But that exists. That's part of the whole white privilege thing that we're talking about. It's not that white people are privileged in the matter, but you know, some of the things that affect certain groups doesn't affect the other, right? So, and then that leads to, again, racial profiling, right? So now this blends right into what we're seeing happening now. I can, you know, look, I was a chair of the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department, so I saw statistics coming onto my desk all the time. I've done research in this. When I tell you that Black lives doesn't matter, well, you know, when you look at the numbers, 7 Black especially young black men, get incarcerated at a rate 7-to-1 compared to, you know, whites, right? And then we drop it down to Latinos. It gets a little bit better, but that's still a 2-to-1 disparity, right? So there's something wrong, and they're getting collapsed into the system, again, disproportionately. So they're doing the same behavior, but being pushed into the system a little bit more harshly, right? And then, you know, so it's not that, you know, we go back to the Black Lives Matter thing, and then it creates that thing about all lives matter. But, you know, there's a fundamental understanding that Black Lives Matter doesn't mean only Black Lives Matter. You know, it means Black Lives Matter also, too. And then when you see how, you know, the system collapses them, and, you know, even when we go into the incident in Central Park, where the woman says, you know, she uses her white privilege, right? She said, I'm going to call the police, right? Because we do know statistically that if a white complainant calls in a thing, right, then that exponentially increases the chances of the, I don't say the perpetrator, but the other person being becoming arrested compared to if a minority is the complainant. So that's what we talk about, you know, the privilege and how it works into this. I can, you know, I can reflect on my own experience of the situation. I was in my neighborhood. There was a meeting, right, at the Cabana, and I walked over, and they were like, "Who is he?" Right? And then the president of the HOA comes up to me, "You don't belong here." Right? So he does a sociologist. I kind of understood, so I just kind of explained it out. But imagine if it was somebody else that didn't understand how, you know, these things operated, and the problem that it could have occurred from that.
And I thank you so much for sharing that experience, because I think it's difficult for someone like me, who is, by the nature of what I look like, is not going to have that experience, to really understand. And I think this time in history has sort of brought to light, to me anyway, and I think to a lot of us, that those things really do happen. I mean, I don't, you know, we hear about it, but I don't think we realize that it does happen. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, because again, here you are, you know, on the other side of the Zoom call, but a very professional, learned man, and that stuff happens. And I don't think there was previously that recognition that those things happen.
But you know, here's the interesting thing though, Jeff, is that it's completely understandable. It really is, because, you know, we have different lives. You know what I mean? We live in the same universe, but different planets, right? To really understand how this works, you have to really internalize it from both ways, right? Minorities, or minorities, different groups, I call it diverse groups, right? Really, you can't really understand the plight unless you've lived in that, right? So what we do with the programs that we're developing now at onePULSE Foundation is this: we're doing a program so that people of different groups can internalize the plight of the other groups. So now once you do that, you understand it, then you can say, oh, okay, yeah, now I get it. So our activity is basically designed to do that. But, you know, people go through life without really internalizing. So you really can't expect them to understand. It's through no fault of their own, you know what I mean, or our own. We just can't really be expected to understand the problem.
So you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and so I want to bring this up. What would you say? First of all, I'll say, you mentioned the All Lives Matter. What is wrong with saying all lives matter, or in this time saying justice for all? And what would you advise organizations who want to put out that message right now about its appropriateness?
Well, you know, the organization has to first come to terms with, is Black Lives part of what it is they want to involve themselves with? Have a very honest conversation, because what I saw after George Floyd, to me, you know, look, all this is not new, right? It might seem new, but we've been down this road before. It's just being sensationalized through social media and things like that. Nothing has changed. I can throw some statistics out there. Black lives have not improved since the pre-civil rights movement. It has not. Civil Rights Act did not do much for Black America. As a matter of fact, it's been retrograde. Blacks were doing a lot better back then than they're doing now, but the narrative says a little different thing, right? It's so, Black men have been in the system and treated this way, so it's nothing new. So I say to this, though, if you're going to do it, really be there to do it, and not because of a sensationalized media that makes you think that you or the organization want to do it. It has to really come from the heart. Otherwise, it's just words on paper. Everybody did a Black Lives Matter statement, but are they really true to the cause? It's a tough one to literally be true to the cause. You know what I mean? So it really has to come from that place. Regarding All Lives Matter, well, if people grasp that concept, then they're not really understanding Black Lives Matter, because again, yeah, all lives do matter, but there's some inherent things that creates adversities for Black lives that's embedded into the history of the United States. It really is, right? That creates adversity, and it creates negative outcomes. And I can tell you, it's across every social institution. I'm not going to, talk about how it's embedded into education, but it is, right? Education has a manifest and latent function. The manifest function is to teach the reading, writing, and arithmetic to do better in life. But what the education system really does, it keeps people at their social status. And for Blacks, that's scary. Statistics across the board, not just Blacks, but Latinos is one thing like that. That's why we have to, when people say all lives matter, it's just they don't have that fundamental understanding of what Black Lives Matter. It's not that we're saying only Black lives, it's Black lives also. And that's, but we just have to get to that point of understanding. But it gets defensive because you talk about Black, then people start getting defensive, and it goes down to the whole white privilege thing, really. We can't have those conversations.
What would you advise? So I think you brought up a good point is, whether the initial statement after George Floyd was, we stand with Black Lives Matter, or even if it was the opposite of that, organizations need to follow up, as you just mentioned. Don't just use the words. If you were advising from a public relations standpoint, an organization to say, okay, we helped you say that we stand with Black Lives Matter, what's the next statement or the next action that you would like to see? Again, not an individual, but an organization take. Obviously, we want them to back up their words, but what does that look like in real life?
Okay, so an action plan, right? Accountability. Right. So you can say this as much as any organization could say, we take a stand on Black Lives Matter and things like that. But until you see action, I remember, I recall a story or something that happened with Starbucks. Wasn't it something they did at one time? I can't remember the story exactly, but I remember that action. They shut down their operations, I think, for a day and addressed that concern, right? So that's, to me, is an idea of an organization taking action. It was some racial thing that happened at Starbucks, and they said, wait a minute, this is not who we are. We need to get back on track. So then they took action. And, so we can all do BLM statements, right? But until we see that embedded into policy or, accountability, plans of action, well, then it's just a statement. And unfortunately, people operate reactionary, right? Till this tragedy occurred, then we do a statement and then it just sits there. My concern with that whole thing, how it played out was, everybody did a statement. And I will inject that it's not that they really wanted to do a statement. I'm not saying in general, it's just that, this organization, we got to do that. It becomes a competitive edge now if we don't do it. And we're going to be, face scrutiny and things like that. But, you can really see from the culture of the organization if they're going to follow through with that.
And I think, I'm guessing from what you said, don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you were, advising from if you were an outside public relations agency advising a client, an organization, my guess is your suggestion would be, yes, like we like to say, yes, and, yes, we support Black Lives Matter, but and what else are you doing? And maybe now is the time, to come out with what that and is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's great. Yes. And it's better than just, yes, here's my statement. Yes. And so, PR has to me a wonderful opportunity to like really, make some good change in the world because, PR operates on, like I said, the most influential social institution, which is through media. Nothing is more empowering than media, and you control that narrative as as an industry of how that story is told. So people believe things, what they see. So the response then it becomes responsibility, right? But I do see area in PR where we can really change that narrative. Of course, it'll be worth have conversations with whoever your clients are, But I think one thing that we do know is that people we do want to do the right things, and sometimes we kind of get lost along the way, building profit margins and things like that. But people generally want to do good in society, so we can always have faith in that.
Yeah, and I'll put a plug in here, for the FPRA code of ethics that says, PR practitioners are supposed to help be the moral compass for an organization. And so this is an opportunity that we have to do that, right?
I really like that, by the way. That's fantastic. I mean, I can't think of anything more fantastic and amazing. So this group is empowered, and yeah, ethics.
I hope everyone in this group feels that way. Absolutely. So Casey put in a question in the chat, and we're going to open it up here for everyone's questions here. But she asks, if someone has an idea to support greater diversity in their organization, but isn't part of a minority group, how and when is it appropriate to get the minority group involved to ensure that the idea is valuable? So
okay. So let me restate that. So the person is not part of a minority group, but they do feel that the organization should have some kind of diversity included into that. I'm going to clap for that person because I think that's a wonderful thing. But also understanding, what does diversity look like in an organization, right? I think that we should have a conversation on that, right? Because diversity doesn't have to be, again, color that, put the people in there and stuff like that. You can have a completely white organization and it be diverse. And I'm not even talking about stratified by, gender or whatever, as long as the ideology is there for diversity, right? So whether or not the organization has, some or none or whatever, it's the ideology and not the physicality. So that person, to me, is stellar because they can kickstart something that they can go to HR and say, let's do this. But let's put the other scenario. So you're white and you have a diverse group. How do we get the people engaged? Well, there's a likelihood that they're going to look side-eyed. What are you, we've got the discounted principle, like people do things for a reason. It could be the intended reason, or it could be personal gain. So people are going to look like that, right? But I think that if the heart is there, you cannot dispute that. If that individual's heart is there, that will be communicated to the people that are the diverse groups, and they will be gung-ho in helping to accomplish that task.
And I think part of it is, speaking for myself, but I think that the heart of the question is me as a white guy come up with an idea. Do I need to then validate it with the non-white guy in my organization to make sure that it is a good idea?
Well, I caution on that for a couple of reasons, because when you're a minority, they tend to, if a race-based thing comes up, they're going to look at you and ask you, like you're the race scholar, whatever. That happens all the time, and that's something that that's just cultural competency lesson, right? That person might be offended over that. But here's the thing, though, Jeff. If your heart is in it, you don't have to, you just bring it to the table, because there's nothing more transparent than that. I think if it's, again, we talk about the discount principle. If you're looking to gain, some kind of leverage in the organization by bringing this up, oh yeah, diversity is important. hey, that's my end game to advance my career there, that's also going to be transparent. So I say this is that, yeah, just approach them, the diverse members of your group, because you're coming from a good place, and that will shine through and they will be supportive.
Great. Have another question here in the chat from Penny. When trying to spread the message and do the work of a diversity inclusion, how do you reach individuals and groups who are getting their news and information that are sowing division?
Boy, that's a tough one, right? Because you have to understand too that not everybody is going to be on board, but right. But if you can just get a handful, one or two, your work is done, right? I do a lot of mentoring in the community, and the one thing that I had to come to terms is I can't, positively influence all the lives that I touch. But if there's just one or two, then that's all I need, because you know what? It creates a chain reaction. So yeah, a lot of implicit biases are there. And like I said, we really have to have a conversation on white privilege. Let me go back to that again one more time, because people hear that, they become defensive, they don't think that they're effective, and then they shut down all conversations. They don't even want to approach that. But it really does exist, and it's through no fault of their own. It's just part of how we're socialized in society, and so if you and I am affected, if everybody's affected by that, right? We don't see that, there's a need for diversity, right? Because, if people go back to the, affirmative action, you're getting the jobs, right? But that's not even true, right? Because affirmative action actually was a failure. It was set up to get Blacks and women actually traction in life, but it never really worked. But the illusion is that it does, right? And why doesn't it work? Because even though they scoop people up into these organizations, they don't advance. And when minorities advance, it's usually in the role of HR and not really in a decision making. And here's a transaction on that. So because a lot of people, they've never advanced like VP or whatever position, right? They go back and they tell their parents and their family, yeah, I'm a VP at whatever organization, things like that. But they're not really in the decision making position, right? So I guess I go back to saying that we just have to examine how, the privilege I talk about plays into all of that.
I have another question here in the chat. Gabriel asked, what local organizations would you recommend that are working on policy change to support improving diversity and inclusion?
Well, they're Organized Florida. I mean, there are a lot of, I don't want to plug or anything like that, but there are resources online that you can look. If you want to get involved, you will find the organization that can affect, but you can affect the change within your own organization. And it can start from there. That's what I strongly recommend, actually, to be that voice for diversity. And remember, the fundamental thing is that it's not just checking the box. When you bring people from disparate populations in, then you got to put them to work and then help them improve the organization, because I promise you, the more diversity you have in there, this is the science of it, is the better your organization will do. But they have to have the opportunity, like everybody else, to help that organization grow.
All right, I'm going to pause here for a second and switch my screen to gallery view so I can see everybody who's got their camera on. And so if anybody wants to chime in and ask a question that we haven't already touched, feel free to unmute. And we'll just pause here for a second if anybody has. Am I too good at asking questions that I've covered every single possible ground?
I have a question.
Oh, here I see Genesis Margolis.
Yes, ahead. I'm actually a student at UCF in the public relations program, but I did have a question. I'm Puerto Rican and Jewish, so I have ancestry that is minority, but my skin color is not, doesn't show it. And so sometimes I can feel a bit divided in the workplace when I'm trying to spread diversity because I'm maybe not taken as seriously because of my skin color. What's your advice on that? And when I do get into a leadership position, how should I go about that to still relate to the people that are either Hispanic or minorities?
Yeah, so the unfortunate thing about race is that It's a social construct and it's imposed on you. You don't get to determine your race. Society already determines it, right? I can't say that, you know, I'm white because I'm half black and half white. Society already determines that I am black, right? So you have to really, I think, fall onto what, and I know this sounds trite, but let your, you know, if this is what you want, let your heart take you there. I know it sounds trite because people are going to believe what they want to believe. You cannot control people's thought, but what you control is how you navigate through that, right? So you just have to believe in the cause and then just try and make things happen for you, because you're not going to influence people per se that already have their minds made up of how they perceive you based on the social construct of race, if that makes sense. You know, you just have to go in there and say, okay, look, we need a diversity inclusion program, right? And let's go about, you know, starting it. Because you're going to face adversity if they perceive you as, you know, anything less than you are or other than you are.
For sure. Thank you so much. That's great advice.
Also, Genesis, I just want to say, you know, I love the way you phrased that question about when you get into a leadership position. I
Yeah.
love that.
Sounds like
That's
she's on the way.
Thanks.
Anybody else want to chime in with anything? Questions? Anybody want to come off mute? Melissa has questions.
Yeah. So I believe we kind of touched on this a little bit, but let's say as a minority in an organization, you're not in a management leadership level, and sometimes people just don't know where to begin or what to say, or they don't have the courage or sometimes the right words to describe how they feel. How do you encourage people in those beginner or intermediate roles to get the conversation going or change the
That's a good point, question, because it is a, it's talking about race, ethnicity, and things like that. Those are uncomfortable conversations, right? So, and I have to be careful of how I phrase things because I come from a scholar background, right, academic background. So I process race differently, and sometimes I'll have conversations, and then people be like, "Did he just say that?" But that's what the understanding that, you know, scholars see a little differently because we understand how these things are created and maintained in society. So nothing scares us. But here's the thing, though. So you can again control that, right? You can, if you open up the conversation to them, then they may feel more comfortable. It's how you react to them, or even if they may open up the conversation, be gentle with it. You know what I mean? Just like, hey, so, you know, be frank, because like sometimes I'll just be frank and it scares people off. But if you, you know, just again, that's the thing where you can actually control that narrative and make people, you know, feel comfortable about it, and you'll see it from the expression on your face. You know when to push back. I mean, push forward or pull back a little bit. So, but I think I strongly encourage it because you know why? People don't know other people's lives or experiences, so they make assumptions on things, right? And it's called social construction of reality. Um, People that are not a part of a group, they make things up, not, you know, not to disparage anything like that, but they make things up based on their fundamental understanding of the group, and then it becomes an agreement reality, systemic agreement reality with the rest of society. So then they start believing things about other groups based on what the other groups are saying, and then it becomes their reality. But if you're part of that group, then you know that's not true. And I think that if you are part of any minority group, we do have one resource, one advantage, is that we get to live in their world, right? So we see them as multidimensional. And don't be offended if I said them, others, us, or whatever, right? It's part of the phrasing. We get to see how the other group, the dominant group exists, right? The problem with that, though, is that they don't live in our world, right? So they don't see that. So we become one monolith based on stereotypes that's perpetuated through television narratives and things like that. So until they can understand that, then, you know, and that's, I think that's an opportunity for people to have those kind of conversations. When we do, we'll, you know, become a better place, better society.
Thank you so much.
Go
I
ahead.
have and Dr. Earl, this is, I want to get your opinion on this because it kind of goes into that. And this is something that I think as a society we should also move on from. What happens when maybe being part of a minority group kind of pigeonholes you in that company as like you're the Hispanic or you're the Black guy? And I can give an example, a professional example. I'm a former reporter, and from Spanish language, when I was moved to English language, I was the Hispanic beat reporter. And I had to have these conversations with management because they're like, well, what do Hispanics care about? And they were just kind of and I know it's a little education, I want to get your opinion. I said, we care about the same things you do, education, healthcare. But it was kind of like, well, it's all immigration or it's all this. I just kind of want to get your feedbacks at some point, this whole minority majority, I think we should all just be so diverse and inclusion, which is a comment that Sean Cooper put on there, or diversity with inclusion. How do we also move away from that to the point that, this no longer is, well, it's African-American, whereas Hispanic, where we should all just know what's going on and just, be equal to some extent.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because, again, it's that majority-minority relationship, right? But the fundamental thing is that, and you stated that, we are all similar. We're all more alike than we are, I think that most people of disparate groups experience that, where we kind of become the authoritative voice when when people want to ask a question about that. But it's like we're so diverse within our own group that it's not like a one size fits all. But that social construction of reality kicks into them, and they think that we're a big monolithic group. So we have to have those kind of conversations that opens up. And I think that that's actually where diversity programs in general are failing, because they're busy trying to just collect the numbers here. So this does that, this does that, and it's still, and that actually creates more of that balkanizing effect, in these diversity groups, instead of showing that we are actually more similar. So my thought to that is that, sometimes people that ask that or behave in that certain type of way, you kind of have to approach them, strategically, and educate them that, we're, yeah, I get it that I'm, Hispanic or Black or whatever, and say, look, but I don't really have the answer to that because I'm not, just as you're diverse, we're also diverse. But, and again, you can't really fault them because that's just part of the socialization process. And with that understanding, it makes it a lot easier to have those kind of conversations.
I want to jump in because Megan put a question in the chat here, and she asked, can you please share some of the most common or maybe less overt manifestations of implicit bias in the workplace so we can become more aware of them and recognize when we may need to speak up or take action?
Boy, there's so many examples. One, it's just what we just heard. Yeah, so can you tell me, something race-based happens, and they go to the race person for that? That's an implicit bias, right? Or sometimes I tell you what happens in my as an academic and as a scholar. It never fails. I go to do a presentation among my peers, and you see the skepticism, right? That, okay, so all right. Then you open your mouth, you go up there, and you know what you're talking about, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay. And then they say things to you like, oh, I didn't think that you'd understand it, or you'd be able to, or wow, how did you even come up with that? Those are, implicit biases, that emerge from that, and it happens all the time. But when you understand the process, it's not really offensive. But I expect it all the time, when I go among my peers. Also, things, implicit biases. Oh, your hair is so nice. Things like that, little micro, aggression, things like that, that we just take for granted, but those are actually implicit biases. Those microaggressions are manifestations of implicit biases. And then also when we see our counterparts start, going up the corporate ladder, right? while, if you're not part of that group, you stagnate. That's also operating on implicit bias. And it's the simple birds of a feather type thing that's creating or preventing that. So they're all over the place.
Probably have time for one or two more if anybody else wants to chime in. Kenneth has his hand up.
Dr. Earl, thank you for being with us today. A lot of these conversations that people are having in the workplace or outside of the workplace often can be so emotional, and people are so invested in their perspective, and there's a lot of emotion behind it, and it's very personal. How would you recommend, as facilitators in our organizations, can we nurture or foster conversations in the workplace that have the tendency to become very hot and heated, knowing that people are not going to be perfect, people are not going to be always putting their best foot forward, but that should not lead to a disintegration of those conversations? How would you advise or recommend that we foster those kinds of conversations?
Okay, so the first thing is it has to happen in a non-threatening environment, right? And you also have to go into that with the fundamental understanding that, yeah, it might get volatile, but then the other fundamental understanding is that that might be a necessary transaction for resolve, right? But my thing is this, look, we can enter it into these kind of conversations, in a manner that makes it a little discordant, right? If we come in, doing this all preachery or start pointing the finger, right? And I find in a lot of diversity and inclusion programs, there is that proverbial, finger pointing, not intentionally, but when you start pointing out this group, that, and you shouldn't do this, then it starts to implode, right? But if you can go into it, how do I say this? In a manner that's less threatening, with a little bit of levity, people respond tremendously to levity. You can get that message out and make it less threatening. That's how I present, my D&I, presentations, or when I go out there and talk about racism and things like that, because it's the understanding that people are already tense. You gotta break that tension down a little bit so that we can have conversations, and people tend, my understanding is that people tend to open up more when it's not so serious, even though it is a serious conversation, right? So that I find is very helpful. It just makes everybody a lot more relaxed. And having them in forms like this, where, I could have done a whole PowerPoint presentation and things like that, but the conversation is what's important, isn't it, right? We just open up conversations instead of being, PowerPoint, kind of stuff like that. I think that helps.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think also, people are not so fragile. So when those conversations come up, they're uncomfortable or whatever. But if and we just keep talking, people are not be so don't be so maybe offended if somebody, or think that somebody's trying to say something to offend you. But if we just keep talking, I think it usually subsides, and you usually make good progress with these difficult and uncomfortable conversations.
Yes, thank you for that. So she made a really good point. Keep the conversation going, right? Keep it going, because my big fear with this whole what's going on now, D&I is important, but let's not let it be, that moment. It's got to be a movement. And for that to happen, we have to continuously have this conversation so that we're not uncomfortable. We can talk like we're, family about these kind of things. That's one of the good ways to actually ameliorate a lot of this that's going on. D&I won't have a problem gaining traction if we just have conversations. I promise you that. That's the psychology of it.
All right. I think that's an excellent place to leave it. We want to be respectful of everybody's time. Hey, Dr. Earl, thank you so much. I so have enjoyed meeting you through this process and having this conversation. I think it's been incredibly valuable. I hope everyone on the call thinks so as well. And thank you for being part of our community and being part of onePULSE and joining FPRA today.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And Casey, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you both so much for leading that discussion. And thanks to everyone who joined us today and made a donation to the onePULSE Foundation as part of your registration. I'm really proud to be able to share that we've raised over $300 because of your generosity, and the opportunity to donate is still available on the Eventbrite page for this event for a few more hours. So if you'd like to go back after this discussion and make a donation, you're welcome to do that. Before we conclude, I do want to ask that you mark your calendars for the next FPRA Orlando meeting on Thursday, October 15th at 11 a.m. We'll be joined by Wilson Camello, President and Chief Marketing Officer at Camello Communications, who will provide practical tools and tips for public relations strategies to successfully reach growing Hispanic markets. Keep an eye on our website for that registration information, fpraorlando.org/events. And finally, if you enjoyed today's program and want to continue learning and growing with us, please do not forget to renew your FPRA membership by October 31st to avoid the late fees, or you can connect with Paula for information about becoming a new FPRA member. We'd love to have you. Thank you all again for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.